I have some, yeah, but I don't really edit much. I just put it together. What they do now, they just have
Hello. Welcome to tonight's debate. Good evening. This is our third Socratic Club debate for the 2011-2012 academic year. The Socratic Club at Oregon State organizes religious debates between scholars for the benefit of OSU and the surrounding community. The club was founded in 1941 at Oxford University with C.S. Lewis serving as its first president. The mission of the Socratic Club is to provide an open forum for the discussion of intellectual difficulties concerned with religion and with Christianity in particular. Also this year is the Socratic Club's 10th anniversary here at OSU, and it's an exciting milestone for everyone involved. More information on the club and essays by C.S. Lewis are available in the lobby, so please feel free to stop by the table after tonight's debate. And our website is also another great source of information, and it also includes a link to our new YouTube channel, which features videos from many of our past debates. The web address for our website is listed on our brochures, and it's also available in the lobby and up on the screen if you saw it earlier. So, the goal of tonight's debate is, as usual, to answer a question. Have science and technology made God irrelevant? Our two distinguished speakers will address this question in a debate-style format. The structure of tonight's debate is as follows. Each speaker will be given 20 minutes to speak in defense of his chosen position. This will be followed by a rebuttal from each speaker for a total time of 15 minutes. Next, there will be 15 minutes of discussion during which the speakers may ask questions of one another. Next, questions will be taken from the audience for about 45 minutes. Now, these 45 minutes do tend to pass quickly, so I suggest forming your questions carefully, perhaps writing them down during the debate. If you got a brochure and you look on that brochure, there is a space provided for you to write out your question, and we will be collecting those questions at the beginning of the question format. And we will close a little bit after 9 o'clock with a 2-minute closing statement from each speaker. So, our first speaker tonight is Dr. Mark Walsh, who is an assistant professor in the mathematics department here at OSU. His research deals with geometry and topology with particular interest in shapes of high dimension and how this applies to our understanding of the shape of the universe. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Walsh.
We thought the order was reversed.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Whichever you like. What do you want? Funk or Walsh?
We'll do Dr. Funk. How about that? My apologies. I did forget. We switched the order up a little bit there. Okay, so that was our second presenter. Let's go with Dr. Funk. So our first speaker is actually Dr. Funk, Dr. Kenneth Funk, who is an associate professor of mechanical, industrial, and manufacturing engineering here at OSU. And he specializes in human factors engineering with a focus on human factors in aviation, healthcare, and systems engineering, as well as on engineering psychology and philosophy of technology. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Funk.
We'll do this in alphabetical order tonight. Thank you, Justin, other members of the Socratic Club, Dr. Ferngren, OSU students, faculty, and staff, guests, and not least, Dr. Walsh. Thank you for the opportunity to offer my views on this question, which I must say are my own and do not represent an official position of Oregon State University. Has science and technology made God irrelevant? No. And I'll give 4 reasons. From its Greek roots, techne and logos, technology may be defined as rationally devised means to realize valued ends. And applied science is a rational process that provides knowledge to devise those means. To borrow a phrase from General Electric, if you're old enough to remember it, the purpose of applied science and technology is to bring good things to life. And they do. Thanks to science and technology, we live longer, healthier, more comfortable lives than did our ancestors. Thanks to science and technology, we have more choices, more opportunities, more liberties. We live without many of the fears and sufferings of past generations. We're free of many of the physical constraints that once made life poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Science and technology have indeed brought good things to life. But our science and technology work only because we live in an orderly and understandable universe. Is that a metaphysical necessity? No. One can conceive of a universe of randomness, but we don't live in a random universe. Probably nobody does. The orderliness of our universe and our own ability to understand it are evidence for a divine creator and sustainer. So the first reason that science and technology have not made God irrelevant is that they work to our good only because they exist and operate in an orderly and understandable universe created and sustained by God. Science and technology have already brought many good things to life, and of course we'll see advances in all of our technologies. But based on accelerating pace of developments in several key areas, especially nanotechnology, genetic engineering, robotics, and artificial intelligence, some scientists, engineers, and other innovators are making some very remarkable promises for the future. They say that soon we'll be able to fabricate any material or object, physical object, that's physically and chemically possible, and dynamically configure the world around us at our will. The deaf will hear, the blind will see. We will replace our diseased and damaged limbs and organs with more capable and reliable artificial ones. Nanobots, red blood cells sized robots, will course through our bodies, delivering hormones, attacking pathogens, maintaining and repairing cells, tissues, and organs. We'll be able to eat whatever we want without any ill effects. We'll be able to genetically engineer the vision, the hearing, physique, gender, sexual preference, intelligence, and personality of our children. Our brains will be constantly connected to the web, which will contain the sum of all human knowledge. Virtual assistants will help us negotiate the complexities of the natural and engineered worlds. We'll control the world around us by thought. Brain-to-brain communication will permit telepathy, experience sharing, even mind merging. We'll genetically engineer ourselves to the limits of biology and extend and enhance and replace our brains and bodies with machine components. We'll be able to upload our minds into more capable and robust devices. Ultimately, we will become super intelligent, immortal, non-biological race with powers we cannot now imagine, and expand out from the earth and saturate the universe with our intelligence. Well, this may sound crazy. There are quite a few people with very good science and technology credentials that believe it. And I too believe that some of you here could live to see some of these things happen. But even if the reality falls short or takes a little longer than the futurists predict, there's no denying that science and technology are rapidly giving us knowledge and power our ancestors would ascribe only to the gods. However, just as Adam and Eve found in the first human quest for knowledge and power, the devil's in the details. For every good for which we devise a technology, we'll get an evil as well. Next Sunday will mark the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, in which over 1,500 passengers and crew died. About 2 months ago, the Costa Concordia, an Italian cruise ship, struck a reef, ran aground, and partially sank, killing at least 25. The Exxon Valdez struck a reef in Prince William Sound, Alaska in 1989 and released over 11 millions of crude oil into the waters. In 2010, an explosion on the Deepwater Horizon oil drilling ship killed 11, injured 17, and released over 200 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Just over a year ago, an earthquake off the coast of Japan caused a tsunami that overtopped a seawall and caused equipment failures at the Fukushima 1 nuclear power plant, releasing significant amounts of radioactive materials. In 1979, the loss of coolant accident at 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania destroyed the reactor and released radiation into the environment. The Chernobyl nuclear reactor explosion and fire in 1986 killed over 6,000 from injuries and excess radiation deaths, and has so far caused 10,000 excess cancer cases in Belarus. The explosion of the Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, in 1984 killed perhaps 25,000 people. In 2010, more than 32,000 Americans died in motor vehicle accidents. An average of 40 airline accidents occur annually worldwide, with an average annual fatality rate of over 1,000 persons. Emissions from our cars and factories foul our air. Manufacturing wastes and runoff from the agricultural chemicals poison our rivers and lakes. Our present consumptive way of life is not environmentally sustainable, despite promised technological fixes. Overuse of antibiotics has led to strains of bacteria that are resistant to drugs. Our use of the internet may be literally changing the wiring of our brains, reducing our ability to remember, distracting us, shortening our attention spans, and robbing us of the ability for deep reflective thought. The accelerating pace of electronics manufacturing resulting from our lust for digital devices is driving stressed workers to suicide. How can this technological evil occur in an orderly and understandable universe when we possess such knowledge and power for good? Yes, the world is orderly, but it's complex too. And the technologies we create are complex. And the complexity and tight coupling of our technologies make them vulnerable to mishap. And those vulnerabilities are multiplied enormously by the fallibilities of their human designers, users, and operators. Most of these and other technological disasters can be traced to human cognitive, sensory, and physical fallibilities that are universal and that often manifest themselves in human error, trouble, and sometimes catastrophe. But our moral fallibilities are even more disturbing. The self-centeredness, self-love, and elevation of the self and its interests above all else that we all possess to some extent manifests itself technologically in many unfortunate ways. The internet is pervaded with trash and riddled with pornography. Despite filters, spam, hacking, and phishing emails find their way into our inboxes every day. More terribly, 13,756 murders were committed in the US in 2009 with firearms, knives, poison, explosives, narcotics, and a wide variety of other technological devices. In 1995, a mixture of chemical fertilizer and racing fuel was used to make the bomb that killed 168 people in the federal building in Oklahoma City. Boeing 757 and 767 airliners were used by terrorists in the 9/11 attacks on New York City, Washington, D.C. that killed nearly 3,000. About 6 million Jews were rounded up and killed by means of trucks, trains, gas chambers, and other machinery of the Third Reich in World War II. Human moral fallibilities can and will manifest themselves with just about any technology we devise. So, I'm troubled about our future. For despite the promises that science and technology offer, there are perils as well. Will intelligent vehicle highway systems solve our growing traffic problems, or will hidden flaws in the programming result in huge multi-vehicle pileups and coast-to-coast riddle? Will nuclear power reduce the carbon load on our biosphere, or will design errors make more Fukushimas and operator errors make Chernobyls common occurrences? And what about the nuclear waste? The internet may eventually contain the sum of all human knowledge and by it the power to meet the problems we will face, but will our use of the internet change the wiring of our brains and rob us of the kind of deep, reflective thought that we will need to solve those problems? Will ultimate hackers eventually sabotage our minds? Nanotechnology may give us a physical world that's almost limitlessly alterable at our will, but what if due to a design or implementation error, nanoassembler self-replication, a process required for nanotechnology assembly to work, goes awry, spreading quickly over the entire globe, conserving everything in its path to build ever more nanoassemblers? Genetic engineering may give us more productive, disease-resistant crops, but what if smart terrorists use that technology to design invincible disease organisms? We may soon have the ability to choose the physical, mental, and personality traits of our children and their descendants. But will you young people here, will you have a choice, or will you be forced to genetically program your children, knowing that failure to do so will give you the stupidest, ugliest, awkwardest kids in school? Information technology may give us computers that are more intelligent than we, but what if our computers decide that they don't need us? When genetic engineering reaches the limits of biology, and robotics and artificial intelligence technologies may allow us to replace our limited or decaying brains and bodies with machine components, and give us immortality as a post-human race of non-biological beings to carry our intelligence into the cosmos. But will they be us? Will the human race survive that transformation? Or will an accident involving new weapons of mass destruction soon render all of those questions moot? Science and technology have brought us much good, and I have no doubt it will bring us more. But for every promise they offer, there's a peril as well. and I'm more worried about the perils than I am optimistic about the promises. Frankly, given the complexities of the world, the growing complexity and power of our technologies, and our own cognitive, sensory, physical, and moral fallibilities, I think it may take a miracle from God to save us from ourselves. And that's my second reason for saying that science and technology have not made God irrelevant. It may take a miracle to save us unless we acquire the wisdom to realize the promises and avoid the perils that science and technology place before us. Science and technology have given us great power and knowledge, but they have not given us, nor do we yet possess, the wisdom to use them rightly. What is wisdom? Put simply, wisdom is the knowledge and the ability to live a truly good life, individually and collectively. How do we do that? Science cannot tell us, but there is a wisdom literature that tells us what it takes to be wise. Ironically, that wisdom literature is old, some of it very old. It may seem strange to draw upon literature from as far back as the 36th century BC to address 21st century AD problems, but the wisdom of the ancients is worth considering. It's unprejudiced by our present technological worldview. It is uncluttered by the technological knowledge that overburdens us and distracts us from what we should be using that knowledge for in the first place. And it has been tested and affirmed by generation after generation, though all too rarely heeded. So listen with me for a moment to a little of the wisdom of Ptahhotep, Socrates, Solomon, Confucius, the Buddha, Jesus, and a few others. Wisdom from yesterday for tomorrow. By wisdom a house is built, and by it understanding is established, and by knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. One who is of profound wisdom, is insightful, knows what is the path, and what is not, has attained the highest goal. O Lord, give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. The wise man knows that which is desirable on its own account. He who pursues vain things lacks sense. He who follows empty pursuits will have poverty and plenty. To act without clear understanding, to form habits without investigation, to follow a path all one's life without knowing where it really leads, such is the behavior of the multitude. Swathe not thine heart and thine hoard. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion. A tranquil heart is life to the body, but passion is rottenness to the bones. He who loves pleasure will become a poor man. Do not associate with those who are given to change, for their calamity will rise suddenly. Do not winnow with every wind, nor follow every path. Do not busy yourself with many matters. If by surrendering a pleasure of a little worth, one sees a larger pleasure, the wise man will give up the pleasure of little worth and look to the larger pleasure. And as a lesser evil is a kind of good, even so a lesser good is a kind of evil, and it stands in the way of a greater good. Martha, Martha, you're worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary. Seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all these other things will be added to you. A wise heart knows the proper time and procedure. There is an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven. Badness can be got easily and in shoals. The road to her is smooth, and she lives very near us. But between us and goodness, the gods have placed the sweat of our brows. Long and steep is the path that leads to her. It is rough at the first. But when a man has reached the top, then is she easy to reach. But before that, she was hard. The prudent sees the evil and hides himself, but the naive go on and are punished for it. He who hurries his footstep errs. Seek not what is too difficult for you, nor investigate that which is beyond your power. Skill in speaking and efficiency in affairs and ingenuity were not the qualities that Socrates was eager to foster in his companions. He held that they needed first to acquire prudence. For he believed that those faculties, unless accompanied by prudence, increased in their possessors injustice and power for mischief. Be not proud because thou art learned. The master said, a gentleman does not grieve that people do not recognize his merits. He grieves at his own incapacities. With the humble is wisdom. So what do the ancients say that it takes to be wise? First, wisdom requires not just knowledge, but understanding, and especially the ability to discern between good and evil. Second, wisdom entails not just the ability to choose effective and efficient means, but the heart and soul of wisdom is to choose truly worthy ends to begin with. Third, wisdom is not marked by audacity, but by prudence, which is the exercise of caution and restraint in the light of possible evil. And four, wisdom is characterized by humility, not hubris. So how does one become wise? Well, not just by listening to or reading the wisdom literature. One could memorize and mouth thousands of proverbs and aphorisms and still be a complete fool. But a few proverbs are key. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. True wisdom is built on an attitude of respect, reverence, and awe towards God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All wisdom comes from the Lord and is with him forever. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. And they tell us that wisdom can be had. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. True wisdom, then, begins with the fear of God, and in the end it is a divine gift, there for the asking by those who fear him. Science and technology have not made God irrelevant. Science and technology place before us some very, very dangerous perils, and only God can give us the wisdom to avoid them. Wisdom entails choices of the most worthy ends to pursue and of the best means to achieve them. But what is the most worthy end? The greatest good, the summum bonum. Is it pleasure? Happiness? Knowledge? Power? Is it love? Those things may be good indeed, but even they do not fully satisfy. There's a higher good than even these, and we know it. So, each of us seeks something more than these, something bigger and more inclusive than happiness or power or even human love, something that's much bigger than ourselves. Some seek that something in an organization, in a sports team, in a great cause, in a political party, in a nation, in humankind, in an ideology, or in a religion. But even these are not enough. God has set a longing in us. Koheleth said, God has set eternity in their heart. He has set a need for something in our minds and hearts that is bigger than ourselves and bigger than anything we conceive. That longing is for God himself. Despite some difficulties, science and technology have been very successful at providing us with basic goods, like food, clothing, shelter, health, and security. They're even instrumental in delivering some of the higher goods, like knowledge, pleasure, and happiness. But the greatest good is knowing God. And knowing God is beyond the knowledge and power of science and technology. At best, science and technology provide means for knowing about God, not means for knowing him. And at worst, they can, and all too frequently do, distract us from him. There's only one means for knowing God, and that is God's Son, Jesus Christ. I am the way, and the truth, and the life, said Jesus. No one comes to the Father but through me. Have science and technology made God irrelevant? No, for at least 4 reasons. First, science and technology work to our good only because they exist and operate in an orderly, understandable universe. It was created and is sustained by God. Second, science and technology have brought us much good and promise us much more. But given the complexities of the world, the growing complexity and power of our technologies, and our own cognitive, sensory, physical, and especially moral fallibilities, they place great perils before us as well. It may require a miracle from God to save us from those perils. Unless, third, we acquire the wisdom to avoid them. At present, we lack the wisdom to rightly use the knowledge and power that science and technology are giving us. And only God can give us that wisdom, which might be the miracle of reason too. And fourth, although science and technology have brought us much good and will undoubtedly bring us more, the greatest good, which is knowing God himself, is completely beyond the knowledge and power of science and technology. It is accessible only to us only through faith in his Son, Jesus Christ. No, science and technology have not made God their own. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Funk. So, our second speaker tonight is Dr. Walsh. Dr. Mark Walsh is an assistant professor here at Oregon State University in the mathematics department. His research deals with geometry and topology with particular interest in shapes of high dimension and how this applies to our understanding of the shape of the universe. So now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Walsh.
I'm audible, I hope. Yes? Yep. So somebody just walked in. Sorry, you should take a seat here. There's lots of seats if you're interested. So I want to, first of all, thank the Socratic Club for inviting me to speak at this debate, and thank Dr. Funk for a very interesting opening statement. I want to begin just with, I suppose it's a story or an anecdote. One topic that I remember learning about in history class, although I think it's often sort of overlooked, is something called the Luddite Rebellion. Does anybody know what the Luddite Rebellion is? So the Luddites were a group of hand-loom weavers in England, or Britain, at around about the beginning of the 19th century during the Napoleonic Wars. And they saw their livelihoods threatened by the development of much more modern mechanized weaving systems, frame, looms, and so on. And they had a rather direct way of dealing with this problem. They decided they'd smash out the machines, which is, I think, in some sense, an understandable reaction. And their movement actually caused quite a stir. They were, pilloried by most of the establishment, not just for their vandalism, but for their sort of anti-science, anti-technology view. And hence the term Luddite is often used in modern parlance to describe people who are anti-technology, anti-progress. And I think it's worth, or at least I would like to make the point that I think it's possible, on the one hand, to be, as I am, a defender of science, a defender of technology and all of the benefits technology brings, and yet at the same time, I think have a strong sympathy with the plight that the Luddite weavers found themselves in. I think in microcosm, the example of the Luddites, whose movement, by the way, was in the end fairly ruthlessly defeated. Most of their leaders were hanged and so on, although it did, I think, put quite a strain on the British Army, who at the time were fighting Napoleon in Spain and had to sort of spent a lot of time trying to put down this rebellion back home. But I think in microcosm, this describes, I think, in a sense, the sort of problem that Dr. Funk was describing. That we have a huge paradox. On the one hand, we have technology which in principle, and science in principle, which should be of enormous benefit to mankind, and in many ways these things of course are. We have, over the last few hundred years, been able to hugely increase our productive capabilities. We can produce massive amounts of food. We have machines to do amazing jobs. And yet at the same time, we have on the other side of this huge numbers of people living in dire poverty and starvation. We have the really bizarre situation where in the United States and in many other countries, and I don't remember the figures, but it's certainly the case in the US, that over the last few decades, the average working week has increased for many people. Now, that's a paradoxical situation. When you think about it, in any sort of rational, sane society, you would think that improvements in technology, which should of course make life easier for all of us, that should shorten the amount of work time and allow us to have more time for leisure and culture and arts and all these things, but this doesn't happen. As well as that, you have this other situation, as in the Luddite case, of people simply losing their jobs. It's a sort of common fear for many workers that new technology can jeopardize their livelihood or their situation. So we have this huge paradox. And of course, the most extreme examples of this paradox are in the case of war and weapons, where some of the greatest minds of our time spend their energies actually, instead of helping society or making the world a more livable, enjoyable, more beautiful place, put their efforts into creating weapons of destruction and ways to destroy lives, incinerate people, and so on. So this is a huge paradox. And I think it's understandable to have a sort of an emotional reaction to this. I think that many people feel, gosh, science is very cold. It's people use the term materialistic in a very derogatory sense. I'm a materialist, and I'll explain more clearly what I mean by that a little bit later. But people use the term materialistic to mean somebody who's greedy and who just wants stuff. If I say I'm a materialist, you probably think, well, I want a fleet of yachts and a solid gold rocket car or something. But I have I think a slightly better definition of the word that I want to use a little bit later. And so it's understandable to me why people might react against that and seek security and sort of old pre-scientific certainties, ideas of religion, of God, of various other kinds of superstitions. I'm sympathetic to why people feel that way. It's a view that I think is mistaken, and I'm going to outline why I think that's the case here tonight. But I am very sympathetic to why people feel that way, just as I'm very sympathetic to the Luddites and why they decided that the only option they had was to smash out the machines and prevent technological progress. That was the way, given their circumstances, the way they interpreted the situation. To try and understand this paradox we have, I think it's very important not to forget that we don't live in a society which is neutral, where science just sort of carries on. There's a sort of an old Enlightenment view, I think a rather naive view of history, where history is a sort of an upward march of progress, where as we all become more educated, more technologically savvy, more sophisticated and so on, somehow everything's going to get better. And I think, well, take any period of the 20th century, and I think it punctures holes right through that view. It's very difficult to hold that view nowadays, given the kind of history we've had. But there is still some truth to that view, it has to be said. But I think it's a view that needs great clarification and modification. So, what I want to argue is that there is a false choice on offer here. That on the one hand, you have science as it exists in our society, our capitalist society, where production takes place not to satisfy human need, but to satisfy private individual greed. This is the way our society works. So it's no wonder in a society like that science and technology is going to, in the end, play the role of servant to the particular kind of society we live in. I think that's a vital point. I think it's a rather obvious, I think, uncontroversial point. But that's a really important point to grasp. So to understand the sort of paradox that the Luddites faced, and this in general paradox of why developments in science and technology don't help us, you have to understand the kind of society we live in, the way science is done. In principle, we scientists like to think of our work as sort of neutral, objective, and value-free, and in many ways it is, but science is still a human enterprise. It's done by human beings. Who decides what research gets funded? Who decides what particular technology gets used for? Well, it's not necessarily us, and it's not necessarily a democratic decision. So we have to bear all that in mind. I think that is not the only factor in dealing with the many tragedies that Dr. Funk very eloquently explained, but I think it's a very important sort of central factor. So I mentioned a false choice. I think there was a false choice between, on the one hand, assuming that science and technology, because of the way in which our society is structured and the way in which it's carried out, has to be that way. And then on the other hand, that somehow the only way to deal with that problem, to fix that problem, is to sort of hark back to pre-scientific superstitions and sort of ancient certainties about the world. I use the term certainty in quotations here. And somehow that in infusing our scientific and technological world with these sort of pre-scientific traditions will somehow guide us or help us with this problem. I think that's while an understandable and a view, and I'm somewhat sympathetic to why people have that view, I think it's a deeply mistaken view, and I want to try and explain why I think that is so. Sorry, I'm getting feedback. Is that?
If you do back up slightly, I can hear.
I back up. Okay.
Just a little bit.
Technology again. So I wanted to make a few points about sort of what's usually called modern science, or the period of the scientific revolution. And depending on where you want to draw the timeline, there are people who will argue, the first hunter-gatherers were scientists, and in some ways they were. In many ways, what they did was scientific. But I'm going to be, just for the purpose of this debate, I'm going to deal with the period in the sort of 14, 15, 1600s, and I'm going to crudely regard modern science as coming into existence around about the time that people like Francis Bacon and a little later people like Robert Boyle and others saw that it was that first of all the old scholastic tradition going back to Aristotle and Plato and others of sort of trying to understand the world purely through thought and through argument without actually empirically testing things was a highly limited and in many ways mistaken approach, and that it was necessary to fuse the best of the scholastic tradition with the very practical empirical knowledge that existed amongst craftsmen, artisans, and so on. This was something that particular Francis Bacon prioritized. And in some sense, since that period and over the next few hundred years, a revolution took place in science, which dramatically, as we all know, and as was sort of in some sense described by Dr. Funk, dramatically changed the way we view our world. The world, if you sort of, this is unfortunately going to be a very Eurocentric talk, but if you think of Europe around about the 15th century, 16th century, you're thinking of a time where superstition and religious dogma was sort of pervading every area of society. We understood very little about the world, about what caused disease, and what caused sort of flooding and why harvests or why crops failed, all of these other things. And so you can imagine life, in the words of Rousseau, and Dr. Funk mentioned it, was for most people nasty, brutish, and short. And it's no wonder at that particular time that people found great solace in the idea that there was a God that cared for them, that had a plan for them, and so on. On an emotional level, I'm very sympathetic to why these views had such a hold on people, and for many people still do. The scientific revolution, and this is what I want to defend, played an enormous role in moving us from essentially having non-explanations or wrong explanations to actually, and essentially providing us with the only long-term solution to these problems, which was to actually try and understand how the natural world worked. What did cause disease? Why did the crops fail sometimes? Why were there earthquakes, volcanoes, whatever it was? And this period, of course, was also a period of great struggle, both physical struggle, because this was the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and also ideological and struggle of ideas. Just to sort of take the two sort of main or most famous examples of this struggle of ideas between I'm sure I won't use the term materialism here yet, but certainly well, yeah, maybe I will. I would say, roughly speaking, that the main philosophical underpinning for sort of our understanding of the natural world prior to the scientific revolution is the notion of what's called idealism. The counter notion to idealism is materialism. This is the flag that I personally stand under. Roughly speaking, the difference between these views, a materialist thinks that mind, consciousness, and so on arises out of matter. An idealist essentially has the reverse view. Believes that matter, in some sense, is that the idea of a mind, usually God, is in some sense prior to matter. So I take the reverse view. And I think the scientific revolution tilted the balance from, I think, the idealist point of view to the materialist point of view. I think whether or not many people agree with that is a different story, but I think in terms of the actual argument and how we understand our world, I think materialism won that argument. The two sort of main pitched battles of this, of course, were the first one, the most famous one being the struggle for the Copernican model of our solar system to take hold, and the idea that the sun is at the centre and that the planets orbit the sun and so on. This was later, of course, polished off by Kepler, who sort of show that the planets had elliptical orbits, and by Galileo and Newton and others. And of course, I don't need to retell the story of how the Church reacted, particularly after Copernicus, when the Counter-Reformation was in full sort of ferocity, and the role in which faith and dogma and so on played in trying to suppress scientific knowledge and scientific progress. The second, and I think even more significant, battle, which is worth mentioning, is of course took place in the 19th century in the field of biology. And here, and this I refer to where Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace demonstrated that the great diversity of life that exists on this planet is not here because of a designer, because of a creative genius, but actually there's a perfectly beautiful and simple, albeit rather barbaric, natural explanation. This is, of course, evolution by natural selection, which explains how we and all of life on this planet evolved incrementally over a very, very long period of time from simple organisms. This in particular, I think, and again, there was a great struggle, and there still is, including this country, a struggle of ideas going on there. But this in particular, I think, pushed the old dogma, particularly the power of the church and so on, well into the back foot, to the extent that I think the only sort of place where faith could have any kind of role, that the notion of God could play any kind of respectable role, is in sort of very, very distant past, and maybe the original coming into existence of the universe, if that makes any sense, if that statement even makes sense. But certainly in the area of biology, I think God was well and truly pushed out. So, in terms of the problems we face today, Dr. Funk pointed out that we live in an extremely complicated world, certainly true, and that even just trying to get to grips with the powers that are available to us, and the technological powers and so on, is very, very difficult, and there's this sort of fear of will the technology run away from us, and so on. These are deeply complicated problems. And they're problems not simply for scientists, they're problems for all of us. And I think the solutions to these problems require more than simply wisdom, as Dr. Funk described it, although wisdom is certainly, I'm not going to mock wisdom, wisdom is a very good thing. They require, I think, a very, very different kind of society than the one we live in. I think there is an enormous, what I would like to call a democracy deficit, or a democracy gap in our society, where most of us have very little control over the kinds of big decisions that actually impact our lives. And the current economic mess being an obvious example of this. In my own home country of Ireland, I'm seeing this, and this is true in many cases. In many countries, I'm seeing the vast majority of people who had no role in causing the economic crisis, facing severe austerity, and having whatever limited control they had in society being further eroded. So I think there is a huge social, political, economic dilemma that we face, which links into this. And I don't think you can solve the problems, the scientific and technological problems we face, without also understanding that these are social, political, and economic problems. And we need, personally, I think we need a far more democratic society where ordinary people, and particularly people who are involved in producing things and working on things, have much more say in the things they produce, in how they're produced, in how they're used. And that scientists have actually much control over what kind of research they do, where funding is determined in, I think, a much more democratic, need-based way it actually is. So, to get back to the subject of the debate, what role for faith, what role for God in all of this? And this is where Dr. Funk and I think on much of what I said, I suspect we would have agreement, but I think this is where we sharply part company. Well, I'm an educator. And I see my role when I teach is to try and explain facts to my students and to teach them how to think rationally, to use their reason. And I have very little tolerance for faith. Faith, to me, I am a faithless person, and I think faith is overall a very, very bad thing. So when it comes to science and technology, I don't want faith anywhere near it. I want a very high, thick wall between science and technology on the one hand and any notion of faith or God or mysticism or superstition on the other hand. I think the the role that faith has played, and I sort of mentioned some of this in terms of the opposition faced by thinkers and by scientists throughout the scientific revolution by institutionalized faith. I think the role that faith has played, I think, has been a very damaging one, a very retarding one. A sort of very quick example is the role played by certain people of faith in this country who want pseudo-scientific nonsense taught to children in schools in the guise of something called intelligent design. This is a very damaging thing. It damages the scientific capability, the scientific education of people in this country. It's something that has to be resisted by anybody who cares about education. So that's just one example, but it gives you an idea why I think faith should have nothing to do with this. A more dramatic example is, given the kind of technology we have, particularly the technology of a nuclear capability, I don't know about you, but I don't feel comfortable with the idea that there could be people who have control over this technology, the ability to make decisions with this technology, who have strong faith, particularly faith in regards to things like an apocalypse, an end of the world, an afterlife in which all of the problems in this world will somehow be wiped away. I don't like the idea of people who genuinely believe that having any kind of decision-making role when it comes to technology of the nuclear capability. That's my own personal view, and I would like to keep that kind of faith well away from any sort of technological power. So I think to a large extent, it's downright, this idea of faith is downright dangerous. Finally, and I realise I'm almost out of time, just in a purely sort of utilitarian sense, if we think of this problem in the way I think of it, I don't know whether people agree with me or not, that this is a much larger social problem and will require, I think, a real challenge to the existing way we live in our society, a political challenge, a challenge involving social movements and so on. I mean, how do we build this? And by the way, I do want to point out that I'm not assuming that everybody who's religious is somehow, deeply conservative or right-wing. I realise that there are many progressive social justice movements that have taken religious guise. I'm not arguing that's not the case. But I think in terms of making our society, I think, more livable, more democratic, more humane, I think we need a common ground. And that common ground, I think, is just an unsentimental realism about the world and a basic humanism. And I think that whether or not you believe in an afterlife, and I think belief in an afterlife, even if it was true, I think you're better off not believing in it, because I think anything that distracts you from the here and now, the only life we actually know we have. This is the only life we know we have, the only world we know. And it's a world where for a large number of our fellow humans, life is nasty, brutish and short. And I think there should be a great urgency on us to do something about that, to challenge that. And I think anything that sort of takes our minds away from it, that distracts it. Dr. Funk talked about the problem with science and technology is it distracts us from God. I see it quite the reverse. I see the problem with belief in God, belief in an afterlife, is it distracts us from the problems in the here and now. I think anything that takes us away from that, or that gives people consolation maybe, but false consolation, I think is a bad thing. I think we would all be far better off if we stood soberly, looked at each other, realized this is all we have, this is all we know, it's deeply, deeply precious, and essentially embraced our common humanity and the one thing we have, which is our ability to reason. And the combination of those two things, I'm not claiming that will solve all our problems, I don't know, it remains to be seen, but I would argue that that is the only thing we actually have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. So we're now going to move to the discussion section of tonight's debate, for which we have 15 minutes. The speakers will alternate asking questions of one another, and I'm going to allow for free-form discussion in general. Speakers, please limit your answers to each question to about 1 or 2 minutes, considering our time is a little bit short. Also, I would like to remind the audience here to remain respectful to our speakers by not applauding until the end of the discussion. So with that, Dr. Funk, do you have a question for Dr. Walsh?
Yes, I do. Just what is the shape of the universe? 2 minutes.
Do you really want me to try and answer that?
Sure. You got a minute and 48 seconds.
I think I'll honestly decline. I'll decline on answering that. Not that I'm not fascinated by it, but I think that's it.
Okay, we can talk about that some other time. Okay, it's your turn.
Oh, okay. So,
Unless you want me to.
no, yeah. So this is the bit I was dreading because I hadn't thought of any questions. Okay, let me try. So I think I mentioned the idea of common ground, and I think there is a common ground. I mean, there's an obvious common ground we have, which is our common humanity. And I think we both have the same interest at heart in many ways, in terms of, we would both benefit from having a much more democratic, fairer, more humane society. What do you get from having faith or a belief in a God, or whichever particular God you have, that I cannot get just from basic humanist principles in terms of pushing this argument, in terms of the things you aspire to, the things you said we need to do? What does your faith get you that I cannot get just from my basic humanism and my basic materialist ethics?
Yes, it was once called a religion of humanism. It traces its origins back to the time, even before maybe the time that Christianity emerged. So some very, very old ideas. And if you look at the morality that existed in ancient times, it was brutish. It was brutal. The Roman Empire, for example, was terrible, and particularly manifested in the games. The gladiatorial combat, the games, throwing Christians to lions and things, and doing these equally evil things to pagans. And W.E.H. Lecky, a 19th century historian who traced the development of morals in Europe, looked back at the history of morals as how they had emerged, and he looked at, and Lecky, I don't think, was a Christian. In fact, I think he was. He viewed Christ as a historical figure, but he did recognize that Christian morality really changed things, that something to the effect that the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, manifested in things like the Sermon on the Mount, did more to soften mankind than all the disquisitions of the philosophers from Heraclitus on up to Charlemagne. So I think that historically you have to see that Christianity has had a very positive effect on morality. Moreover, you look at I guess I've probably timed out.
You can take a couple more minutes for that.
If you look at different world religions and ideologies, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, the Akan religion in Africa, Eastern religions, if you wish to call them that, you find a remarkable similarity in ethical principles. Honor your parents, the idea of spousal fidelity, not killing others, not stealing, not lying. The only way I can see to explain that, and the whole idea of value, is a moral order to the universe and a moral lawgiver behind it.
Well, so I don't think you answered my question. Let me try and rephrase it another way. What I'm saying is, my own view on this is that any discussion of morality has to be a discussion about human suffering and human well-being. Okay? So I start with a basic axiom, which is that I want to live by the happiness of my fellow creatures, not by their misery. And I think when I have a choice I have to make that has some moral implications, I should try and choose the path which causes the least amount of suffering and maximizes happiness. Now, I don't see anything in that requires belief in a God or anything supernatural, and that's what I'm trying to understand. You seem to be suggesting that somehow I cannot form this, or have a moral output without, or maybe I'm misunderstanding you, without belief in a God, but maybe you can comment.
No, but I think it is most perfectly manifested in a morality that you find in Christianity.
But that certainly doesn't bear out in practice. Take any moral position you like, any political movement you like, and you can find people who will find a Christian way of justifying that. I'm not arguing they're right or wrong. I don't know enough about theology to get into those arguments, but there were Christians who fought on both sides of the Spanish Civil War. They were Christians from my own country of Ireland who stood on pulpits and encouraged young Irish Catholics to go and fight for Franco, saying this was the moral thing to do, and made Christian arguments for doing this. At the same time, there were also Christians who went and fought for the Republican side, just to give one example. So I don't see that there's any sort of coherent, well-defined morality that comes out of Christianity. I think Christianity is deeply incoherent and vague, and I mean, it seems to me a very dodgy way to try and build a morality. I think a simple declaration that we should try and minimize suffering and maximize happiness is a far more sensible way. And the difficulty, of course, is finding the path that does that. I'm not arguing moral philosophy is a complicated subject, but I think you can start with a simple axiom and build up using reason and rationality and science, because understanding the world better equips us to make those moral decisions, to actually try and find that path, or those paths. Maybe there's more than one of them. Going back to ancient texts, which are vague, often have rather barbaric implications, I think. I mean, in order for you to sort of say that Christianity is a progressive morality, you have to do a lot of cherry picking to make that happen. And I don't know under what criteria you do that cherry picking, other than the criteria I'm talking about, which are just basic humanism.
So the charge basically is hypocrisy.
No, not hypocrisy. I'm simply saying that consistency is what I'm looking for. Okay.
Well,
you're leaving out, an enormous amount. How do you decide this? If you're going to claim that morality comes from a God, well, first of all, I don't see how you decide whether what that God is saying is moral or not, unless you have some basic humanist criteria like the one I'm suggesting. If, on the other hand, you simply think that whatever God says, is moral, well, then I don't see what kind of morality that is at all. God can say anything, and it would be moral. So.
Well, I think you are accusing Christians of hypocrisy and inconsistency, and I'm guilty of that. I'm a hypocrite myself.
Okay, not my intention to accuse you. That's not.
No,
independent of you or anything else. I'm simply saying let's put aside for a second whether or not my doubts about the existence of God. Let's suppose this God made himself present in this room right now, so we all have to accept that he was there, that he was objectively existing, and that what he was saying was not vague, it was clear, direct, and it was clear what the implications were. That doesn't make it moral.
Well, first of all, I take no offense at being called a hypocrite. I freely acknowledge that I am one. In fact, I think probably the only way of avoiding hypocrisy absolutely is to have no moral standards at all.
You will make it good.
We are fallen. The Christian position is that we are fallen. That God has decreed a law, has decreed a moral law, but we are fallen. We are fallible creatures, and we have fallen. And it's certainly true that Christians are in many cases guilty of the same kinds of atrocities that the pagans were in the past. The difference in Orthodox Christian position is that we are fallible and we are incapable in and of ourselves to achieve the moral standards that God has set for us. And indeed, the focal point of the Christian message is that we are incapable of saving ourselves. We're incapable of the kind of democratic, just society that you seek, because we are inherently self-seeking and self-interested. And it's only by redemption through Christ that God justifies us according to his law. Now, does that mean that we automatically become perfect people? No, it doesn't, but it means that we strive, and we could expect that those who have accepted the atoning work of Christ do recognize their responsibility, and through God's grace and by his power lead more righteous, more just, more loving lives. We fall short. We fall short, and we will fall short in this world, unfortunately. We believe that there's more to that. That is, the idea of knowing God sometimes is spoken of salvation, of being in God's kingdom, eternal life. That is a state not in this material world where, united with God through Christ, that we are perfected and these problems that we face are overcome. There will be a miracle in the end. There will be a renewing, a passing away of the present material world, of a new heaven and a new earth, in which these problems won't exist. So, I believe that that God has declared. And I think that you say that in order to sort of justify a standard that God sets forth, that you need to base that in terms of human morality. I think it's just the other way around.
I'm going to cut that off right here. And Dr. Funk, do you have a specific question for Dr. Walsh?
You said that you are, I think you said that you're a faithless man.
Yeah.
How do you define faith?
I suppose belief in something on insufficient evidence.
Okay.
Holding a view that's not supported by evidence, or is very poorly supported.
Most dissertations have 100, 150 references. I suspect yours probably, you know.
My
Yeah,
dissertation,
dissertation.
like 45 or something.
Oh, that's okay.
I don't know if that's good or bad. Maybe it means like.
Do you know beyond a shadow of doubt that those references you cited and used were valid? That you had worked out, that you had proven those theorems yourself, you had verified that?
Well, I see where this is going. So I mean, I certainly was very careful in citing, but I mean, ultimately, yes, you can then say, well, hey, you know, the guy you cited was careful in his citation, and we can trace this all the way back. And at some point, I'm going to have to go, yeah, okay, I'm not completely sure. So you've got me there. True. So. How is that? I mean, okay, if you're going to call that faith, then you dilute the word faith of all possible meaning. I mean, there's no way that my confidence that the mathematics of my dissertation, given the work I did, given all the checking I did, my confidence in that is anything like the confidence of a Christian that a man 2,000 years ago turned water into wine. I mean, there's no way those are even in the same league. Now, okay, there's a spectrum here, I admit that. Okay, there's a spectrum here. But at some point, we need a word for describing belief in insufficient evidence. And it's not how careful I check my thesis. That's not in the same league. It's when you get to things like belief in, you know, a man turning water into wine or rising from dead. That's what I call faith, because that goes against everything we know in modern science, everything we know about the world. There is an overwhelming block of evidence to suggest that kind of stuff just doesn't happen. There isn't an overwhelming block of evidence to suggest that I screwed up in my dissertation.
I'm not suggesting but Michael Polanyi was, are you familiar with Polanyi? Polanyi was a physical chemist. He was, I think, from Eastern Europe, and he immigrated to Britain, was a member of the Royal Society. He wrote a book called Personal Knowledge. And in personal knowledge, and let's talk about knowledge and faith. So Polanyi said that knowing is a fiduciary act. It's an act of trust, and his theory was nicely summed up by Leslie Newbegin that said that all of our knowing, is a personal commitment in which there's no external guarantee that one cannot be mistaken. So the way I would define faith is that faith is knowledge. It's on a continuum from pure speculation to absolute confidence, somewhere in between. But it's knowledge on which I'm prepared to think and to act at some personal risk. So my Christian faith is a knowledge which is, I can't irrefutably prove that Jesus turned water into wine, but on the authority of the Scriptures, on the authority of the Church, by my experience with other Christians, by reasoning, by looking at the reasoning of others, by looking at the rational arguments of others for the existence of God. I believe on the authority of authoritative sources, of reason, of empiricism. I believe that that's true.
So you used authority a lot of times there, and you sort of snuck in empiricism at the end. I'm not quite sure where the empiricism comes into this, but I will simply conclude with my position that I agree with Bertrand Russell on this. But Russell once said that once anybody makes the point that nothing is completely certain, they should always immediately follow that by saying that some things are far more certain than others. And that's the point I'm taking. It's not that, I mean, you're right, I cannot be absolutely 100% certain to say that there isn't a God, even though I call myself an atheist. But, you know, I look at the evidence and I make the best judgment I can based on the evidence. And I can definitely compare some statements with other statements to say that that statement is far stronger and more based on evidence than another statement. For example, I think, my confidence that if I knock my phone on the ground, it will possibly do some damage, which it did recently, is a far stronger statement based on evidence than I don't know whether you believe that somebody actually literally turned water into wine, but there are people who do believe that, then that's it.
Yes, well,
There's no comparison. I mean, they're just on completely different places on the spectrum. And we need a word for that end of the spectrum where people make outrageous claims.
well, there are sources. They're not comparable in some certain sense. One sense is the sources of knowledge. We talked about authority, about empiricism, about reason. Those are three sources of knowledge which I like you, I consider them valid. And I think reason is an important source of knowledge. There are other sources of knowledge on which I base my certainty about things like Jesus' miracles and more important things than those, frankly. There's intuition. And presumably mathematicians use intuition, and they back it up with reason.
That's the important bit, though.
Yeah. But there's other sources of knowledge as well. There's the sources of knowledge of at least there are people who have believed for a very long time as mysticism is a source of knowledge. That is a direct apprehension of reality, a direct connection with reality. And I believe that one aspect of that is revelation. I believe the things that the Bible says, for example, by the revelation of God's Holy Spirit directly to me. So you discount the possibility of that as a source of knowledge. To me, that is a very, very real thing. And I guess I can't. And he's looking at his watch, and there's 2 or 3 minutes left here. And I can't.
I think it would take a little longer than 2 or 3 minutes to answer your revelation.
So you and I can continue this conversation later. Many experiences as well as feelings throughout my life that convince me that what the Bible says is true, that the authority of the Scriptures is valid. And that comes not without reason, comes not without empiricism, and certainly not without authority, but it comes from a direct apprehension of reality, a direct apprehension of God through His Holy Spirit. That's my experience. That's my empiricism.
Thank you guys for that spirited discussion there. So we're out of time for the discussion. The speakers will now take questions from the audience. We have approximately 45 minutes for this total question audience time, and it does tend to go by very quickly. So when I give the word, please form 2 lines, one on each side, and we'll alternate between the 2. If you have a question for Dr. Funk, please line up over here on my left. And if your question is for Dr. Walsh, come over here on my right. If your question is for both speakers, that's fine. Just pick whatever line is shortest. And please, have your question ready when you get in line. When it's your turn to ask a question, please begin by designating which speaker or speakers your question is for. And very importantly, please keep your question short and to the point. Please refrain from giving a statement of personal opinion, arguing with any of our speakers, or delivering a speech of any kind. We will cut you off. Also, please return to your seat after asking your question tonight, as we don't have enough time for rebuttals or follow-up questions. So you can now begin forming the lines. Speakers, if an audience member asks a question to one speaker in particular, I'll allow that speaker to answer first. From there, the other speaker can comment as well, if desired. But be aware that lengthy answers to each and every question would limit the number of questions we can accept. Please use your speaking time wisely. So in general, limit your answers to about 1 or 2 minutes at most. And so, can I have the first question here for Dr. Funk?
Placebo is the most often observed divine intervention. God has been called an opiate of the masses. Does that make her a placebo? And can we quantify that effect?
No.
Dr. Walsh?
I'm not.
So next question for Dr. Walsh. Yeah, well, okay, just state your question very clearly and very carefully. If speakers, if you can restate the question and make sure you kind of understand what it is, and that way the audience in the back can also hear it, hopefully.
Dr. Walsh, you mentioned something about progress of society, of our human world. I was wondering what your standard was for that progress and how that standard is established.
Gosh. I mean, I suppose it's relative. I mean, I have to look at, what we think is possible. I mean, just to give a quick example, I mean, there is easily enough food right now to feed everybody on the planet, and we have resources to feed everybody. It's not a problem. The reason that people die is not because there isn't enough food, it's because they don't have the money to buy it. So there are political reasons behind the fact that people are starving. But it doesn't take a lot of human imagination to see that there's something deeply wrong about that, and that there's a way in which it could be changed. So I guess it's relative, but it doesn't mean. So I don't have an absolute blueprint if that's what you're asking for. But I think have a reasonably good way of comparing one type of society with another and saying this is morally better than the other society. So I guess that's the best I have.
I think it's because there's a moral order built into the universe, and I believe that we're capable of apprehending it, of understanding it to a certain extent. Our understanding is fallible, but it's there. Value, the idea of value, something's better than something else. The basic idea of value is, I believe that's built into the universe, moral order as well as a physical order.
Next question.
Okay, Dr. Funk, you mentioned, you spoke about pursuing vain ideas, vain courses of action. In Ecclesiastes, the preacher says all things are vanity. So it sounds like a conflict to me.
Yeah, the book of Ecclesiastes is a difficult one. It seems to be full of very deeply disturbing things. But there's a key phrase in Ecclesiastes that you see around 20 times. Under the sun, in this present world, all things are vain. But the preacher, Koheleth, is able at the end to look out and see, to get the bigger perspective, to get God's bigger perspective. So yes, under the sun, ultimately all things are vain. But there's more than just under the sun.
Is it really?
No follow-up.
Oh, is there anyway? Yes.
Dr. Walsh, do you have anything else? No. Okay. Next question.
Dr. Walsh, I have a question about the last point that you made, and if I perceived it correctly, was you stated that religious views, particularly for Christianity, can be harmful for our society, and therefore religious authority should not be admitted to power. I guess my question is, do you think that people that are atheistic and don't have a religion, do you think they will be less harmful with their corrupted, power-driven, often views than people with religious perspective that are often powered by views such as love and compassion that are taught in most religions?
So I want to be very clear about this. I'm not suggesting that we put some sort of ban on religious people getting into positions of authority. People have the right to run for office and people can vote for whoever they want. I simply express concern about the fact that there may be people in positions of power who make decisions about things like life and death and war and so on, who maybe claim to hear God is telling them what to do or whatever it is. So I express concern of that. I find it deeply uncomfortable that people with apocalyptic ideas may be in positions of power. That's a problem. Now, as to your point about atheism, atheism is a position with very little content. So to say I'm an atheist really doesn't say very much about it. I could be an atheist and have any political view you want to think of. So there's no guarantee that if the only thing you knew about me was that I was an atheist and that you voted me into office, there's no guarantee that I wouldn't be a complete maniac. There's absolutely no guarantee at all. So I'm not claiming that. I was simply making a point about people who have a longing for the end of the world being in a position to make decisions with dangerous technology. That was the only point I was making.
And if I could, that's a case clearly where we need wise leaders, and particularly leaders and people in authority, people that have their finger on the button, that exhibit prudence and humility, not hubris.
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah. This is for Dr. Funk. I would like to know your opinion. If we had the chance to go back 200, 250,000 years to the dawn of our species and teach them everything we know about chemistry, agriculture, astronomy, that we're not the center of the universe, that there are microorganisms, how volcanoes work, all these things, if we could teach them that, and we teach them about the Big Bang, do you think at one point people would have said, okay, these ideas are great, but let's write a story about talking snakes and tree of knowledge and call that the start of the universe? Do you think that would have actually happened? And if so, then the Bible probably would not have Or at least the Old Testament would not apply.
I don't want to give another glib answer. Well, I don't think that we could have taught them.
What's hypothetical?
Right. I believe that the Bible in which you're taking aim at is informed by God's revelation, not by human knowledge. Even equipping people at that time with a knowledge of the universe as we know it now. Well, certainly, the Bible would be different now. The creation account might be different, but I don't think that the main point of the story, that is our fallen nature, the need for atonement, the redemptive work of Christ, I don't think that would be any different. It might be set in Manhattan instead of Palestine, but I don't think that the main points would change.
Dr. Walsh? Okay, next question.
This is actually similar to another question, but you said that they should be kept away from science and technology, but the world needs more democratic decision-making. And so how would you like to see Christians or apocalyptic Christians kept out of that decision-making? And is that fair, even if it could be done?
So,
could you repeat the question?
So do you want me to repeat the question? Yeah, my understanding of the question is that the questioner wants to know, if I understand you, how I would make it happen that faith was kept away from science, is that correct? And in particular, how people with apocalyptic views would be kept away from positions of power. So again, on the second part of your question, I'm not suggesting we pass legislation that says anybody with Christian or religious views should not be allowed to vote for positions of power. This is, I'm a Democrat with a very, very capital D, and I don't mean in the party sense. So, of course, anybody should be allowed to run for office and have any views they want, and people can make that decision. All I do is express concern about the fact that there are people in positions of power, and I'm not just talking about Iran and places like that, even in the Western world, people who claim that God gives them advice on foreign policy and so on. That's something that's very worrying. What's particularly worrying is when those views are given any kind of respectability. I guess that's really what I'm getting at, is that we shouldn't respect faith positions. Those kinds of positions should be subjected to ridicule, and that's all I'm arguing. So it's a conversational argument, it's nothing else. Sorry, I've forgotten your first point was how do I separate. With regard to separating faith from science, one example is I don't think that intelligent design should be taught in the science class. I think that should be a fairly uncontroversial position. I would think at a university, I would assume this is an uncontroversial position. I'd be surprised if it was a controversial position here. I'd be quite sad if it was a controversial position here. But that's a very clear example that in the realm of science, we do science and we don't bring in faith. That's all.
Dr. Funk? Yep. Okay, next question.
I am neither a Eurocentric nor a Christian-centric. I'm an engineer, and I have gone through 5 religions, anywhere from about waist deep to neck deep, and none of the religions can stand out for teaching us morals and ethics. Any religion that cannot herd its sheep into a moral, good way is a failure. All the religions are failures.
Do you have a question?
It's a question, yes. This is for both of you people. And that is, as long as we don't put together God and knowledge together in one place, I contend that atrocities are going to happen both from the technological advances and by the holy wars. Now, this whole debate, I think, is unnecessary.
What is your question?
My question is, God is knowledge. Do you agree?
Well, only part. God is omniscient, but there's a lot more to God than knowledge. And I believe that knowing God is the greatest gift.
I honestly don't understand what the phrase God is knowledge means, but I would say just, well, actually, no. I'll leave it.
Okay, next question.
Okay, I have a question for Dr. Walsh in his capacity as a mathematician, and it's about logic. So the resolution tonight is have science and technology made God irrelevant? Now, this presupposes the existence of God, right?
I suppose it does.
Okay, so now as an atheist, if you say, no, you deny this assumption, shouldn't you actually answering this question with no? Or in other words, is this a loaded question?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Did everyone hear the question? Yeah. So I think certainly if you interpret the question that way, then yes, it is a loaded question. And I guess, I've never been a fan of debating clubs, and one of the reasons why is that often what happens when I was an undergraduate, and I would sometimes go and watch debates, and the debating clubs would often have people that sort of only find out on the day which side they're going to take, and they have to just argue a position when they didn't necessarily agree with. And so in some sense, I don't literally agree with the statement that science and religion has made God irrelevant. For one thing, the way I'm interpreting it is I replace God with the idea of God, because obviously I don't believe in God, so I clearly don't think there is a God to be made irrelevant. What I'm assuming the people who organised the debate wanted me to talk about was the idea of God, the notion of God. Second thing, just if you take the question very literally, well, I've lost the debate immediately, because of course, to vast numbers of people in the world, the idea of God is very relevant. So if you interpret the question as, have science and technology made the idea of God irrelevant to most people, well, of course that's inherently not true. So I have no chance if that's what I'm arguing. What I'm trying to argue, I suppose, is the best position I can take, given I didn't write the motion of the debate. The best position I can take is to say that I don't think that in terms of the problems we face, that the technological problems, the political problems, and so on, that the ideas of faith or God are in any way helpful. In fact, I think they are in many ways detrimental and dangerous, and I think we need to be very wary of this approach of trying to bring in God or bring in faith to solve these problems. I think that's the position I'd like to argue.
Dr. Funk? Okay, next question.
So this question is mostly for Dr. Funk, but if Dr. Walsh would like to speak as well, that'd be fine. You say that authority of the scriptures is valid. So how do you think the women in Salem, Massachusetts regarded the biblical verse that reads, "Permit not a witch to live"?
I don't know the genesis of that particular passage, the cultural context in which it was given. I think that you have to take that in the context of Christ's teaching that, first of all, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. I don't think that what happened in Salem was a reflection of the golden rule to do to others as you would have them do to you. I think the treatment of those women were not consistent with Christian teachings. Again, I don't know the cultural origins of the original admonition, except to say that it was a reaction against paganism and the need to place worship of false gods in a proper perspective. Did it literally mean to go out and burn women who acted a little bit differently? I think not. That's a difficult question, but I think that you have to look at it in the light, especially of Christ's moral teachings. And I think that I would be very reticent to put flame to a human being in light of Christ's teachings about our responsibility to our neighbors?
Well, I don't know a great deal about the witch trials, but you say it was sort of motivated by an antagonism towards paganism. And from what I understand, the little I do understand about it, was mostly motivated by antagonism towards women, and towards women having any sort of control or making any sort of progress given their status in society. Most of the witches, there were male witches burned too, but the vast bulk of witches that were burnt were women. And I think what it shows is that any political or political point of view, I don't know if I want to call it a political point of view, but any sort of agenda that human beings have, if they want to, they can find some kind of passage from the Bible, some kind of religious justification for it. That's what I mean when I describe Christianity as incoherent. That the very fact that, I mean, the fact that you struggle so much to try and interpret the comment in a way that made it more palatable shows that this is open to really nasty, dangerous interpretations, and that's why we shouldn't give it respect.
Dr. Funk?
Yeah, move on.
Okay, next question.
I have a question for Dr. Walsh. Earlier you said that through humanism we can pursue a higher moral standard to make life better for people living on this planet. And I'd like to say that in the past 2 centuries, we've had thousands to millions of people who have pursued this goal of higher intellectualism, superior races, and socio and economic equality that resulted in the French Revolution, Nazi Germany, and Soviet Union. On what basis can you decide that we have a moral understanding, and how can you decide that that decision of yours, what is a moral and higher goal that we pursue, is right?
Everyone hear the question? Yeah.
Rephrasing your answer.
Well, I'm not sure I fully understood it. The question, it seems to be asking me, given various attempts at creating, strongly used quotations here, better societies or better worlds, and he mentions the French Revolution, the rise of Nazism in Germany, and I can't remember the other one you mentioned. Soviet Union. Given these examples, how can I think like humanism is a way to? So I don't. First thing I don't understand the connection with humanism. I mean, I don't see how, in any stretch, sense, any meaning of the word humanism, that Nazi Germany would be considered in any way a humanistic society. I have absolutely no idea where that comes from. To me, with all of those societies, I think that the concept I probably hate the most, and it's strongly related to faith, and I'm not sure if it comes from faith or faith comes from me. I think the concept of the thing that human beings do that I hate the most is obedience. I think obedience is one of the worst things. And I think if you look at the great crimes in history, the Stalinist purges, the Holocaust and so on, if only there had been people who were willing to be a little bit more disobedient, a bit more willing to question authority, to not simply do what they were told, not blindly follow orders, not have faith in their leaders, I think a lot of these great disasters could have been avoided. That's all I'm arguing for.
Well, I attribute these great disasters to this basic self-interest, self-love, the elevation of the self beyond all else that predominates in human behavior. And it manifests itself, unfortunately, in all groups of people. And that is why we need the redemptive work of Christ. That's why we can't save ourselves. It's the fourth point I made, that the greatest that is known God is accessible only through Christ, through Him. It's through the atoning work of Christ that can be possibly redeemed, and never completely, fully in this world.
Next question.
Science and technology answers the who, what, where, when, and how of an issue, but does it or can it answer the why or purpose of the universe, our existence? Is the question why meant for philosophers and theologians? Others need not apply?
No, I think that each of us brings to every question such as this, every problem, every piece of data that we get, a worldview that is our fundamental beliefs and assumptions about reality. And one aspect of our worldview, a question that's been explored by philosophers for millennia, is the idea of purpose. Purpose, life exhibits purpose. Animals, plants struggle to live. Societies struggle to survive. We have, we desire certain things. The idea of value drives us in certain directions. So purpose is very much an understanding what that purpose is and how I fit into the purpose, if there is one. That's very central to all of our questions. It's very central to all of our worldviews. So, no, it's not just for philosophers, it's for all of us.
Next question.
So, as you were talking about, Dr. Walsh, about reason as a mode of proof, it's kind of been said, and kind of as an example with being able to reason really simply into a circular paradox in and of itself, and it's kind of echoed by Spock. That reason can be used to justify anything, and actually reason itself out of use, almost. Maybe not out of use is a really way, but just essentially be able to use to validate both sides of an argument. So, what's your reaction to that, and do you think that there's ways to temper reason, or...
Well, there's something called evidence,
yeah,
right, which is very important. So, I mean, a well-known example of the danger of sort of using pure thought to, say, talk about the real world is, Aristotle's declaration that if you drop two balls of different weights, they'll fall at different rates, depending on the heavier one, and others will hit the ground first. And of course, this was argued not by experimental evidence, but by pure reason. And of course, so you have a certain point that if you spend your entire time arguing, you can make big mistakes, right? To purely argue.
Yeah.
But of course, we have a way of checking that empirically, which Galileo reputedly did. And so there may be, I'm willing to concede that there may be some dangers in relying purely on our ability to think our way through something to talk about the world. But we have another tool, another weapon at our disposal, which is evidence and experiment. That's very, very important. And that's how that's the only surefire way to know. I'm a mathematician, and what I do doesn't necessarily say anything about the real world at all. If I want to apply my mathematics, I have to actually do experiments. I can use a mathematical model maybe to make predictions about the world, but it's only as good as or only as useful as it actually bears out in practice. So practical experiment is the thing I think that you need to include in your description.
Thank you. Next question.
Can I follow up?
Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
The idea of reason as being the sufficiency of reason, I think, is a question. And I would say that there are some cases, certainly, that it is not. And there are a couple of reasons why reason is not sufficient. And one is because there are limits to what we can know, just what the evidence that we can get. But more importantly than that, and actually closer to what I do, is something we call bounded rationality. That is, each of us, I talked about our human fallibilities, especially our cognitive fallibilities. We all come equipped for some reason because of the way our brains are, with certain decision biases and so on. And one of them is something called anchoring. That is, sometimes when we adopt an initial hypothesis, and maybe it's based upon some partial evidence or something like that, it's difficult for us to abandon that hypothesis. And we will go even further than that. Another cognitive bias that we have is called confirmation bias. And that is, not only do we hold on to that initial hypothesis, we misinterpret evidence so that that evidence is deemed consistent with that. And actually, the strongest effect of confirmation bias is that we will not seek contradictory evidence. And an example of this was, maybe you remember in 1988, the USS Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser, shot down an Iranian airliner in the Gulf of Hormuz. The aircraft had taken off from Bandar Sarbar airport, And it was headed right for the Vincennes. It was climbing. And indeed, the data from the Vincennes show that there was evidence there that it was climbing. The crew misinterpreted it. They were being attacked by gunboats. It was a very distracting situation. So, in fact, in the presence of that evidence, in a time of stress, a couple of cognitive biases and probably a host of other cognitive biases came to bear. And so reason under those circumstances was not sufficient to get the evidence, to take the evidence that this was an airliner climbing and misinterpreted it as an F-14 descending on an attack on the Vincennes, and they shot it down with 2 Standard missiles and killed close to 300 people. I could give other examples of where bounded rationality of, and so there are certainly conspiracy theories about what went on. But I know enough about military personnel, I know enough about pilots, I know enough about the operators of complex systems to know that these are not irresponsible people. These are not people that are malicious. These are people that have common human fallibilities, and because of those fallibilities, they're not always rational.
Okay, next question.
It's primarily directed towards Dr. Funk. I'm kind of curious, so the argument tonight is in reference to science and technology and God. So I think like kind of the more fundamental question, science is, or technology is an application of science. Do you find the concepts of modern science mutually exclusive with God? Can you accept an understanding of evolution and an understanding of string theory, an understanding of an expanding universe, and rectify it with what's presented in the Bible? Is that feasible? It's really open to either speaker, but I think it's a fun question.
Yeah. Yes, I do think it's consistent. So first of all, I believe that God commissioned technology. In Genesis, in the book of Genesis, there's something we call the cultural mandate, where God created humans and commissioned them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. It is impossible for me to conceive of a world filled with humans that was not made possible through technology. And another reason why I think that technology is perfectly compatible with God's order in the universe is that the Bible says that man was created in God's image. God was creative, man is creative. Our technology is a result of the divine commission. So I don't think that science and technology are incompatible with the notion of God. Now, with regard to the question of evolution, I can view the creation account in Genesis as literal. I can view the creation account as figurative. I've gone back and forth on this several times. There are Christians in this room, people who I agree with on all the important points of doctrine, who would argue strongly for what we call theistic evolution, an evolutionary process begun, created, guided in every step by God. I'm not willing to dismiss that as a possibility. And I know that it sounds pretty strange that the possibility of a literal 6-day creation 6,000 years ago. The universe is a weird place, and there may be weird things that we just don't know yet. I'm not willing to reject either hypothesis at this point.
I'll try and be brief. I mean, I personally find these notions incompatible. That's my own position. I'm well aware that there are people who manage to. Human beings are very adept at holding contradictory views in their head. And I know there are some very fine scientists out there who happen to be committed Christians. I don't know any who believe in a literal 6-day creation, but I do know plenty of scientists and plenty of Christians in general who do accept the notion of evolution by natural selection, and they manage to make it compatible with the belief in a God where I don't quite know how they do this, but they somehow argue that God set up the conditions or maybe helped evolution along or something. I have various views on this. I have to say that I became disillusioned with organized religion in my early teens, but I still had some vague belief in a God. Once I fully understood evolution by natural selection, it utterly shattered any possibility of me ever believing in a creator God again. That's my own experience with this. I realized that lots of people manage to hold two views. I can't.
Next question.
Thank you to both speakers. Appreciate it. Question for Dr. Walsh. As a mathematician, how do you account both for the universe, the uniformity of nature, and the remarkable ability of mathematics and mathematical models to describe the physical world?
It's a very interesting question. When you say the uniformity of nature, I mean, I have trouble with that notion because I see a great deal of randomness in the universe too. And we evolved in that universe, and it helped us to survive, to be able to see patterns, recognize regularity. So this is something that, you know, if we couldn't do that, I think we wouldn't exist in the first place. Mathematics itself, I mean, mathematics, it's a very difficult and deep question where mathematics comes from, I guess. I mean, there are obvious human practical needs that motivated the development of mathematics, that motivated counting and numbers and so on. This, you know, developed over a long period of time. And so, as it developed, I think, at least for most of its development, I would say, nervous about saying too much on this because I'm worried experts on history of mathematics will pick at what I'm going to say. But my own view is that mathematics actually, even though it's a very abstract process, has a very practical sort of basis, very practical reasons why it developed. And although it later on took on its own sort of internal dynamic, its own sort of abstract dynamic, where mathematicians just, you know, look at the question, look at the axioms, raise questions just based on the axioms, which have no obvious relationship to the real world. The motivation behind much of mathematics was in solving practical problems, and that's the reason that it developed to solve problems in the real world. And so, in a sense, it by definition had to be relevant to the real world. Now, it is quite extraordinary. I accept that you know, there are many very abstract mathematical notions which were invented without any, well, I can't get in the minds of the inventors, but without any maybe obvious application in the real world, which maybe 100 years later were precisely what was needed to describe, you know, some particular real world phenomenon. That is very interesting. And understanding why that happens is an interesting question. I'm very interested in it. I will say that I don't see that there is anything in that, interesting as it is, that I think in principle couldn't be explained with a materialist understanding of the way we've evolved, the way mathematics has developed. But it is a very interesting, I mean, the way mathematics is so good at, you know, making, you know, predictions about nature is a very interesting thing. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
There's an orderliness in the universe, a set of laws by which things seem to happen. And we can explain the existence of, well, life, for example, and even human intelligence based on those laws, but where do the laws come from? That orderliness manifests itself in the physical order of the universe and in the moral order of the universe. It manifests itself in the human mind that's able to comprehend the universe. And I believe that the source of that is God.
Next question.
My question is for either of you, and it's derived from my personal hope that there is some room to grow in our technology, science and technology, to solve at least one of our problems in the world. And I guess to do that, many problems are solved by individual postdoctorates or teams of postdoctorates in abstract fields. And from my research, I could find nothing that doesn't point, that only pointed to a lack of faith-based postdoctorate holders. And I was wondering, and although there's a rough edge to this, I hope you can see past it, and the potential in all of us, even if we don't hold high degrees in that education. Is there something, or a way that, is there something that's holding people back in faith-based lifestyles from pursuing these high degrees in math and science? Or is there, that's my question, if that makes sense.
Do you guys understand the question?
Is there something that's holding, so maybe...
It's based on the census that I found.
Okay. So is there a reluctance on the part of, let's say, a Christian to pursue an advanced degree in biochemistry? Is that... well, I think that in many cases, you'll find that in biochemistry departments, but there's a general, well, they would share Dr. Walsh's views about it. And if Dr. Walsh were going to be, let's say that he was in biochemistry, a biochemistry prof, and he held a materialist view, and I held a Christian view, I would be very scared about studying under him because we might not be able to come to an agreement on basic fundamental, why things work the way that they do. I might consider that he might not let me progress in my studies. Actually, I don't think that you would do that.
I'm a very nice guy. Yeah.
He's a very nice guy, and I don't think he would do that. But so I shouldn't have used him as an example. But there certainly are faculty who would not really be willing to take on a student who had theistic views. So yeah, I think maybe in some cases there would be a reluctance for Christians, let's say, to pursue certain scientific fields.
I'll just respond to what you said about reluctance. I don't know that. I guess when you do mathematics, there are mathematicians I know who believe in all sorts of strange, superstitious things, and I think in mathematics, in some sense, even though people regard it as this, the king of kind of rational thinking and so on, the human mind is very adept, as I said, at holding bizarre, contradictory views, and I know mathematicians who have very strange views about the world, and they get away with it because mathematics is abstract, and as long as you're good at working with that, you can sort of get away with nonsensical views about the world. It's not so easy for a biologist, and I think you'd have a very tough time just being an evolutionary biologist if you believed in literal six-day creation, right? I don't quite see how you'd make that work. So if I was a biology professor taking on a PhD student, if say I was an evolutionary biologist, and my PhD student, I wouldn't care what personal religious views my PhD student had, but if it turned out that this student had a literal six-day creation view of the world, I think it would just make the work very hard to do, if not impossible, probably impossible to do. So that's a problem. So if you happen to have views about the world which are just false, well, it's going to cause you difficulty as a scientist.
Okay, I'm sorry, that's actually all the time we have for questions tonight. So thank you all for your participation. We're now going to close with a short 2-minute closing statement for each speaker. So applause is fine. Dr. Walsh.
Thank you all for coming. It's been an interesting evening. I'd like to close with a couple of quotes from two of my favorite sages. One I've already read. Mencius, a Chinese philosopher. To act without clear understanding, to form habits without investigation, to follow a path all one's life without knowing where it really leads, such as the behavior of the multitude. I don't think this group really reflects the multitude. I would ask you, as you think about science and technology, whether you are a Christian or an atheist, I would ask you to think about what is truly good. Remember, technology and science, they're about bringing good things to life. Think about what is truly good. And how do science and technology help or hinder the realization of the good? And to close, let me quote from Solomon, another wise man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will keep your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil.
So I just want to make one sort of clarifying point just to finish with. And this is the issue of, I use the term divisiveness because I think religion by definition is a very divisive thing. With regard to the problems that we both discussed, the problems we face, I argued, and I want to reiterate the argument, that what we need is a common ground, a common human ground on which to stand, where we can all agree that we want to do something about problems like hunger, problems like war, various types of suffering that have bedeviled the human species for a very long time. And having views of faith, views of certainty, I think, on this issue, I think, are a problem because they divide people. So, in a practical sense, in the sense of actually, say, doing something, suppose we want to do something about sweatshop labour or some other immoral practice, I don't care if the person I campaign alongside on that issue is a Christian or is a Buddhist or has any religious view. That's their own personal business, and they have every right to hold those views. And what matters is that we do the right thing, that we actually change, fight the injustice, challenge it, and so on. And what allows us to do that, what allows us to unite together in this, is that there's a common understanding that we're both human beings and that there's something wrong with this issue. It may be that the person I'm working with, the Christian or Buddhist or whoever I'm working with, has a religious interpretation of what they're doing. They may say, well, we should do something about poverty because we're all God's children, and I may say, well, we should do something about poverty because we're all brothers and sisters in humanity. But in the end, we're both doing the same thing, and that's very important. And so, what I want to caution against is sectarianism, I suppose is the word for it, of holding to a view where you sort of discount other people on some sort of worldview issue or aspect, and that we need to just work on the common intersection, the common humanity we all have. Atheist, Christian, whatever, that common intersection is what we need to focus on, and leave the faith and the religion to the personal and the private, but campaign together what we all have in common, which is our humanity and most of all our ability to reason.
Thank you all for attending tonight's debate. The speakers, as well as members of the Socratic Club, will be around for a few minutes to answer questions. If you'd like to receive email announcements of upcoming debates or are interested in joining the Socratic Club, you can sign up in the lobby. We also have free C.S. Lewis essays in a box where you can submit topic ideas for future debates. And some additional information will be available up on the screen. Again, thank you all for coming, and let's have one more round of applause for our speakers.